Welcome to Critical Conversations in Children's Literature, a web series I developed to bring children's literary writers in conversation with scholars to discuss critical topics brewing within the field. My name is Lashon Daley. I am an assistant professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at San Diego State University. My areas of research and teaching are focused on children's literature as it intersects with folk tales, girlhood studies, and media. This series is funded by the Department of English and Comparative Literature at San Diego State University and is hosted in collaboration with the National Center for the Study of Children's Literature. Today's conversation is centered on the topic of collaboration within the industry of children's literature, specifically between a children's book author and a children's book illustrator. And I want to quickly define what I mean by collaboration. So I've defined collaboration as, according to the internet, it's working with someone to produce or create something. So collaboration is active, it is social, and it requires a product. I also want to consider how collaboration is an act of co-laboring to exert one's power of body and mind with effort in accordance with another body. So today's guests are Newbery Award-winning author Matt de la Peña and New York Times bestselling illustrator Loren Long. Matt de la Peña is the author of middle grade novels such as Mexican WhiteBoy, We Were Here, and Superman Dawnbreaker, as well as a handful of picture books, including The Last Stop on Market Street, one of my favorites, for which he won the Newbery. And Loren Long is the illustrator of a former President Barack Obama's picture book of The Icing, which we read in my class, Mr. Peabody's Apples by Madonna, Changed Sings by Amanda Gorman, which we also read in my class, and a host of other picture books, including the Otis series. And so we are here today specifically to discuss their thoughts on collaboration and how they collaborated on their picture book, Love, which was published in 2018 and also a New York Times bestseller, as well as their most recent collaboration, which is currently being developed. So I want to thank you both for joining me today. This conversation actually started as a result of Matt de la Peña speaking about his illustrators as collaborators, and I thought that that would be a really interesting conversation to have. So thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I actually want to start off with asking you, Matt, what does collaboration look like to you? How do you define it? Why do you do it? And why could it be important for us to understand how collaboration works within the industry?
Well, first of all, Lashon, I love that you're looking at children's literature from a professorial standpoint. I mean, it means the world to creators like Loren and I, because we take our work seriously and we just love when academics do too. For me, collaboration is, it's like a breath of fresh air, because when you write a novel, you're all alone in a room. You're by yourself with your thoughts, and most of those thoughts trend toward doubt, like, can I really do this? Is this story really that interesting? But when you get to work with another person, now you got a team, and I don't know, so in some way you can bring out the best in one another. I'll take Love, for example. When Loren and I got paired up to work on Love, we had never met each other, but I ended up doing a visit near his home. So I actually drove to go check out, his early sketches. But before that, we actually met at a conference to talk about the book. And to this day, I think Loren can speak to this from his point of view, but it was one of my favorite conversations I've ever had about children's books. And it went so far beyond our text that we were, starting from, and the pictures that he was going to sort of tell a second story, in and out of the text with. It was like we were talking about what we believe in, what stories we want to tell, what's our point of view as storytellers. So I think when you get two people who want to do their best possible work and you put them together, it makes something greater than you could do on your own. And I think that's why the collaborative process is so important to me.
Thank you. Loren, do you want to jump in?
Yes, Lashon, I thank you for having me and including me. It's fun for me because Matt and I published Love in like January of 2018, and we've been fortunate enough to talk about it together many times, but it's been a while, right, Matt? So
Yeah, it does.
So this is fun. I think also, Matt, wouldn't you agree it's probably a good idea to point out that this isn't this kind of a collaboration in children's book makers between an illustrator and an author isn't the norm.
It's a good point.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think this is like the exception, right?
Yeah. For example, I started out illustrating. My very first picture book was written by a wonderful writer who happens to also be in Ohio by the name of Angela Johnson. And it was my very first picture book called I Dream of Trains. And Angela Johnson has an amazing MacArthur-winning Genius Award career. And I did not know her. She, at the time, lived in Kent, Ohio. And I worked with the folks at the publisher in New York. And here I am in Ohio, 4 hours away, three hours away from her, but we had no communication. In fact, we spoke once at a conference and called it the non-collaboration collaboration. And Angela is a beautiful poet, and her texts, you know, she joked that she could write some of those in like 30 minutes. And then the illustrator spends like 7 months to make the paintings. But I will say, even though she has a poetic, that was a poetic reverie, you might say, but it was more narrative. So it was a character, a little boy who goes through and things happen to him, a beginning, a middle of an end, and an end story. When I came across Love, I had never, and by the way, I'd illustrated other people's picture books as well. But when Love was sent to my inbox, I knew of Matt's career, but like he said, we didn't know each other. He was just coming off the last stop on Market Street. And of course, I devoured that like the rest of the world. And I'm also a fan of Christian Robinson, the illustrator. So I didn't know anything about this other than Matt's poem for Love. You know, our book here was a very, you know, what lyrical verse, right? Poetry, big ideas, big, colorful, musical words. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, Matt, but so for me, it was very helpful. I didn't even, at first, when reading it, I wasn't even sure if there was one point of view or different points of view. And so for me as an illustrator, and I suppose I was comfortable with my career at that time. So for me, when I met Matt and I saw that he was open to discussion, all of a sudden, I think it really unlocked something not only to make that book stronger, but it actually unlocked a part inside of me that I wanted to do that moving forward. Not always, and we can get into that later, but so for me, that collaboration just made it so much stronger, especially because we could even break down examples, but I could see I wanted to see what Matt was thinking when he wrote particular lines.
You know, and Lashon, we should also add that the reason why publishers like to often keep illustrators and writers separate is because they're protecting often the illustrator. I think some writers have this sense of ownership over their text and they want it to look a certain way. So I think it has to be the right two people to have a process like ours. Like I would never impose any creative ideas on the visual story upon Loren or any illustrator I work with. My job is to write a song, and it could be about a character, or in this case, a concept. And so that's why I think it has always worked with Loren and I to have these conversations. We're in one now about a new work called Home. And it's so great to talk about it because we don't talk about what he's going to do visually. We talk about, what is this story? Like, how does it apply to my life? Where am I coming from? And so I think it's not about what Loren's going to ultimately do, because that's his job and that's his space.
Yeah.
That's really wonderful to hear. So what I'm hearing is that there are good reasons and other kinds of reasons as to why you would want to collaborate and why the industry chooses for illustrators and writers not to generally collaborate. So let's get into specifics. What is really wonderful about collaboration, and how did you all do it? Like, do you make calls? Does Loren send you sketches? Or Loren, do you call and say, what do you mean about this sentence? Here are my thoughts. And if you can also talk about when it's not going well, perhaps in the conversation about love or the current project, like what are some of the tensions that come up when you are collaborating?
You know, Loren, do you want to talk about, there's one line in there. I'll tell you what it was originally, and then maybe Loren, you can kind of talk us through your process, and we could talk
Okay.
about how the text changed because of Loren's
Yeah.
sketch. So the original line was, and in time you learn to recognize a love overlooked, a love that wakes at dawn and rides to work on the bus, a pair of old house slippers that fit like love. So Loren gets this, and you want to talk us through your thought process?
Yeah, and since there is some video, this is that manuscript. You can see I'm making notes. I'll back up just a little, Lashon and Matt, to say that when I first got this manuscript, you know, even though I believe I was going to meet Matt, interestingly, coincidentally, at a conference coming up, I sat on this for a while. And then when we spoke, and it was kind of in passing, like on a bus ride,
Yeah.
but it was enough to say, hey, is it okay if I call and we have a conversation? And so I really talked to Matt, I believe, before I even did one sketch, but I just
Yeah.
had my ideas. So I usually just brainstorm and write, ideas, not even sketching yet, but just ideas of what images could be. So it was very helpful to talk about Matt and a couple of the hard parts of this. Wasn't an easy illustration job. It wasn't just a spotted dog that it starts raining and things happen, and which is also, I love dogs, spotted dog rain books, not a bad thing. I'm not against those, but this was such a profound poem that as the illustrator, I needed to get inside it a little bit. And Matt, and how the only way to do that is talk to the person that it was inside and then brought it out to life. So but I love that Matt just automatically went to the we call it the burned toast image, because as the illustrator, I've got numerous sketches. You remember, Matt, I had like a bunch of things, the little kid trying to figure out what kind of underwear he was wearing and what kind of apartment he lived in, what kind of family structure. These are all the things that aren't in the words, but they're the things you think about when you're the visual creator, like a film director would. What are those props that mean something to the meaning of that moment? So I had a sketch of a little boy, and I was so happy with myself because he's looking out the window in a snowy morning and he sees what could be his father or mother walking to the bus, sort of taking a leap from Matt's words, that moment when he's seeing somebody else sacrifice for him. So I had a little boy, and he's standing at the window in an oversized pair of house slippers, because I was thinking maybe that's his dad's, and he sort of slips into him and walks around before school. And then I thought it would be nice to have kind of like my own life. I had an older brother that sometimes took care of us while we were latchkey kids before mom and dad left for work, and then in the afternoons. So I had him handing the kid a piece of toast, and I was thinking, realistically, the kid's older. He's not really going to have an omelet. He's going to have like a piece of toast, and a glass of orange juice. And to me, that really brought another story to Matt's words. And I still had the little boy in the house slippers, I think. No, I didn't. I cropped it closer. I
Yep.
cropped it closer, then like around mid-waist. And those visual parts are so important. Could you imagine that image if it wasn't zoomed in just right, you know? And then I think you could take it from there, Matt.
Yeah, so Lashon, I see this sketch and I was like, for me, the house slippers, my Mexican grandmother always wore the same slippers. We'd get her brand new ones. And, for Christmas, she'd be like, oh, thank you so much. And then she would never wear them because she only wore the old beat up ones. So I thought of her and I thought of the house slippers. And I just thought of working class people. And I think Loren and I share that. We come from working class backgrounds. So, that's what I was thinking. And then I get this sketch with this big brother handing his little brother something to eat. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is like a second layer of love to this vignette that I had never thought of. So for the first time in my entire career, I crossed out my line about the house slippers and I wrote a slice of burned toast that tastes like love. And Loren now says that's the best line in the book.
It's the best line. But can
It's
I?
not fun though, right?
And that is true collaboration, but also I'll point out, Matt, that at that point in time, Matt and I had maybe 3 discussions. We were able to sit down at another time across from each other over breakfast at another event that we were both fortunate enough to be in and connect. And that time, I think we planned ahead. Let's make sure we set a coffee aside or something. And I think we were for 2 hours, I was taking notes and we were going through the story. And by this time I had already started some sketching, I think. But it's important to point out at that point, then it was time for me in other words, I was not sitting in Matt's office when he was writing. And so we weren't in constant, just speaking to the details of the collaboration, we weren't in constant deliberation and discussion. I just went off and did my sketches and started doing, and working directly with the editor and the art director on my side. So when Matt says he saw my sketch, it actually, at least then, it wasn't me sending him my sketch. It was me sending the sketch to the editor and art director, and them, and I think in part because of Matt's profile already in the field of children's literature, they were sharing with him. I've seen that more. Back when I first started illustrating, I don't think I'd work with an author. I'm not sure the editor was sharing much with them. Recently, it seems like the illustrations I've done for other authors, the editor does share, and I think it's more out of enthusiasm. Hey, look what's going on here, So I thought I would point that out.
And Loren, I think this is something that not everybody knows. The collaborative process goes beyond the illustrator and writer. It's also the editor and the art director. So there's so many people collaborating on these books. So we're the forward facing part of the collaboration, but there's also, an entire team at the publisher. And I think we're thrilled with the team we have. I mean, they've been really good to us. They worked with Loren in terms of the trim he wanted, the size. I guess that's the same thing. Art technicalities, I don't know.
Same thing, but
yeah. I just wanted to underline it.
Yeah, there's so many. Matt's so correct. There's so many people that are giving input. Like you do think about, is this going to be a square book? Is it going to be a horizontal book? Is it going to be a vertical book? What size? And one of the things I'm really into looking over is what kind of paper, what kind of finish is that paper? I want as high quality of paper as I can get from the publisher. And then there's a whole financial piece behind that of, how much is this P&L sheet going to be or whatever for each given book. So it is, I will say the thing I love about children's literature is there's so much creative freedom in the author and the illustrator, much more, I think, than almost any other creative fields that I always hear about, advertising and even editorial magazine work. There's sometimes people think that's just totally free. Sometimes there are lots of eyes on it. When it gets down to the cover and that kind of thing, there might be some meetings where they show it, but just making the book, it's like Matt working with an editor, me working with the same editor, and me working with a designer, like an art director.
Yeah. Lashon, can I add one other thing? So, because we're talking about collaboration, it's kind of exciting to talk about this because, we now have talked about the editor, the art director, but there's one other collaborator, and that's the reader. And I think Loren and I are both very, very aware of leaving the reader's space. There's one image that the text is so spare. It's not only stars that flame out, you discover, it's summers too, and friendships and people. And so that's very spare text. But then Loren took it and, he created an image that also leaves a lot of space for the reader. And we've heard so many interpretations of that single vignette. So I think that's part of the collaboration too, as the reader.
That's a good point.
I didn't think about how the reader does play a part in that, because they're also dreaming and thinking of other things too, right? I know sometimes when I'm listening to work, it then points my memory elsewhere, or I'm imagining the text, even if I can't see all of the details yet, if it's being read to me, just because a lot of my students, we do read children's picture books in classes. And if I can't get all of the illustrations, I'm also imagining images myself. So that's really great. One of the questions that I have asked in all of these series, so the first conversation was with Libby Gruner, who is the current president of CCICL, which is the academic side of children's literature and its study. And then I had a second conversation with Len Oliver, the co-founder of SCBWI, and now a conversation with you all. And so the question that I asked both of them is, how can collaboration work in the industry and in the academic side? And why are they so separate? So I'm just wondering, can we imagine a world in which the industry and the academic study of children's literature can come together and collaborate? And what would that look like?
You want to start, Loren, or you want?
Well, I may start with more of a, fascination with the question, and in the sense that why isn't that already a bigger presence? I've interacted a lot with, in other words, educators that are teaching people to become educators, and educators that are teaching people to become librarians. And we see them and interact with some of them, but why couldn't we be having this kind of a thing like we are with you, Lashon, more prevalently? Because it does make a lot of sense, but I don't exactly have a good answer.
Yeah, I wonder why too. Because it's obviously most of our work is sitting in a room and just doing the work. But when we do get a chance to go out on the road, solo or as a team, and go into a school, it's incredibly informative. Like you get to go on the inside of this process where young people are learning, and you pick up so many things, like how invested are the teachers in the text? Do they just read it once and then move on? Or do they really talk through the book and the pictures and how the words and pictures work together? So you see that, but then also, zooming out a little. I know when I walk into a school and the principal is right there when I walk in the door, I know there's something different about that school than when the principal doesn't come out of her office the entire time. So it's fun for us to watch that. One other thing that came to mind was this. I think, sometimes children's literature is marginalized in the academy. So it's like, we're going to study serious literature, adult literary fiction, YA, we look down on it a little bit. Picture books are for kids. So I'm starting to see a real growth of the study of children's literature in academia. And I'm thrilled about it, because I don't think we're trying to write books for 5-year-olds. We're trying to write books for humans. And it just so happens that our I guess, most passionate audience is the younger people. But, you know, I read love, especially love, above all my books. I read it to high schools. I read it at college classes. It's the end of every keynote. So I think one of my missions in life is similar to yours, Lashon. I want to take children's literature seriously. As a reader, I'm blown away by what other people are doing in the field of picture books. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
The things that I know that comes up for us as academics in the field is that we take your text and then look past it. So even looking past, we're coming up with theories and thoughts that don't necessarily show up in your text, but are thinking about how race shows up, how gender shows up, right? And all of these things that the author and illustrator may not have fully considered in the same way we are kind of critiquing the book. So I know that sometimes is a reason why it can be super awkward to say, oh, this book, while it is about love, is actually deconstructing, heteronormativity or something like that, right? So
Yeah.
the ways in which we're thinking about that. So I can see how those conversations can be hard, but I am really curious about, like, how do we do this better to where authors and illustrators don't feel like we're criticizing, like it's a critical act, but it doesn't have to be kind of negative criticism, but also how we're like wanting to be invited into the conversations, right? So CHLA, their conference, and SCBWI don't come together. And what would it be like for both academics and those in the creative side come together, sit on a panel and say, well, when you illustrated that, I'm looking at this through this theoretical lens, and this is how it shows up in that text, right? So I just kind of recognize that it would take a lot of work, but I definitely think it's worth the work.
But you're kind of doing that, right? This is like probably the focus of what you're doing is bringing people together, right? Academics and creators.
So kind of thinking about final questions, I'm wondering, now that you both have collaborated well, and now also on your second project, who can you imagine yourself to collaborate in the future, and why?
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, where would you take this, Loren? Another president? Another president?
Okay, I've illustrated a Newbery medalist, president, a future president, and Amanda Gorman. We can all agree.
Yeah.
But this may sound like a cop-out, Lashon, but I intend to collaborate with myself a little bit more and explore myself as a writer. I've always said to young illustrators or authors or anyone asking my advice, I've always loved and appreciated out of my career the ability to illustrate other people's texts. So I started out only illustrating other people's texts, never thinking I would be a writer myself. And then after writing a few things in the beginning, like Otis the tractor, I started realizing I have a little bit of that visual storytelling ability that can also translate to my own ideas. And I don't feel like an accomplished author so much, but I do have ideas. And so I want to explore more of those. The beautiful thing is being able to take a special Matt de la Peña project and a project like Change Sings, written by Amanda Gorman, and put those into the thread of my career, so to speak. And I don't know that I would ever shut down. I do know friends who are authors or illustrators, and they only will illustrate their own stories. And I admire them and respect that. But for me, I love the idea that, Matt de la Peña wrote another story called Home. And if I was too busy with, I mean, if I was only shutting out my own stories, I wouldn't get that opportunity. Lashon Daley may write a piece down the road that I would love to read, and they have such beautiful ideas. My stories are a little bit more narrative and character driven, whereas at least the illustrations I've done for Matt and people like Amanda Gorman and even President Obama were a little bit more poetic and big themed. So that's kind of my feeling.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, Loren has many books on his own, and obviously the Otis series got, very big and is now a TV show. But yeah, what other stories are you going to do? I don't have that liberty because I am not a very good visual artist. Loren's seen me draw a
You've
horse,
got it.
and
His horse is pretty good. I just
thought
have
it
to
was good.
interrupt.
I thought it was good, but people don't like it. But so the feedback I've gotten is that maybe I should always work with a professional. But I think, Loren, also, you said one of my favorite things about collaboration to our agent. We both have the same agent. And I think Loren told me that he said to our agent one time, think of me for projects that you normally wouldn't. And I love that because he wants to be surprised. He wants to be challenged to go in a direction he never considered before. So I would actually steal that idea and say, I would love to work with an artist that I don't even know who they are yet, because maybe they have a vision I've never considered. One of the things you were talking about earlier, Lashon, is about, as a professor, taking a text, looking at it, but then going a little outside of the text and like exploring the racial implications of this image with this text. Well, to me, that's like the amazing thing about creating a book is it's just a tool. It's a tool for those kinds of things. It could be a conversation between a professor and her class, or it could be a parent and their child, or just two friends, but it's just a tool. And, for writers, you have to be humble because sometimes your story is being used as a tool and it's lauded in that way, right? It's like, this is a great example of, showing restraint, but it also might be criticized. It might be in a time where it's like, look, this is an example where an author had a blind spot. And as a creator, you just have to realize like, that's just part of the way your book is going to be used once it's no longer yours. So I think that can be a similar process, could be between collaborators that you don't know. Like maybe they're going to see something I never considered. Like the reader is smarter than the writer sometimes, and I love that idea.
And Matt, real quick, Lashon, I would add on to that. There is a certain amount of bravery it takes to put your art out there and create art. That Matt used to tell me that I always said, oh, I'm not really, I'm not really a natural activist or whatever. And he pointed out to me that I am sometimes with my art, with my imagery. And, but that made me feel good. Thank you, Matt. But at the same time, it's like, there's a certain amount of bravery it takes to put it out there, because then you are the critic of every reader, whether it's a 4-year-old or an educator like yourself, Lashon. And I love that and welcome that. And I also know that I'm not always right. And we try our best, I think, even in my station in life and the type of person I am, I try my best to give love through my art. And even before I illustrated love. Can I also add one nuts and bolts thing, Lashon? There may be listeners that want to be an author or an illustrator for children. And even though we have this wonderful collaboration and I hope, and it's going to do book 2 and maybe projects in the future. In general, if you're not published yet and you're an author, it's best not to look for an artist to collaborate with. unless that artist is very professional and, you know, accomplished, because publishers do want to buy a brand new text from a brand new author. And if you're an illustrator, I always just say, submit your work, unless you're a writer too, submit your art, and maybe they'll choose your art for somebody else's story. And the same for the authors. Is that confusing, or did that come out okay?
Yeah, I think that
I
makes
think
so
that's-
much sense.
Yeah, super, super helpful information. And I get that question a lot, especially from friends who are often saying, oh, well, I should find the illustrator on my own and then we can come together and then submit. And, you know, everyone has different thoughts about where you should submit and how you should submit and how much you should submit. But I think that's really helpful information, especially coming from someone who really understands the industry.
Yeah, I mean, there are some exceptions. There are some, but it's usually between two fairly accomplished people with art and text.
Are there any final thoughts that you would like to share with our viewing audience before we end our conversation today?
Loren, I got to get this book right. I'm almost there with the text.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to see what you do with it. It's so interesting to talk about the process from the beginning, having already finished one book and been on tour with it. It's like, it doesn't matter how far along you are in your career, you still have this tremendous like fear and doubt. Like, are we going to be able to do this right? You know, do you feel that
Yes.
too?
I do. And I know it's going to be a book that a lot of people will see, and there may be some folks that will anticipate it because of Love had such a big impact.
Yeah.
But you know, I've illustrated books by high profile, you know, authors. And at the end of the day, right, Matt, all we can do is sit in our studio and give the best of ourselves.